Now, let's get talking now. Fiscal policy is the tool used by government to promote macroeconomic stability through sustaining aggregate demand and private sector incomes during an economic downturn and by moderating economic activities during the period of strong growth. To balance the use of resources of public and private sector, and by so doing, avoid inflation, unemployment, balance of payment pressure, and income inequity. Often the effects of fiscal policy aren't felt equally by everyone, depending on the policy orientations and goals of the policymakers. A tax cut could affect only the middle class, which is typically the target or the largest, economic group. In times of economic decline and rising taxation, this same group may have to pay more taxes than wealthier upper class. Let's start our discussion today with this, and joining me to understand the federal government's new fiscal policy measures and issues around it, a lot of reactions around this. I have a professor of finance and capital market, president of also the academics, capital market academics of Nigeria, Professor Uche Uwaleke. He joins me live from our Abuja studios to talk about this. Professor Uwaleke, well, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's always good to see you. A very good afternoon, and it's indeed my pleasure.
Prof, let's get going, because immediately we saw reactions coming in from the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. We got reactions coming in from the CPPE, that's the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises. We can go on and on. Even NECA has reacted to this. That's the planned fiscal measures by the federal government, looking at some tax and some import duty issues. First, what will be your overview of this document? We know government needs money, but it shouldn't be at the detriment of businesses that are trying to also struggle to survive.
Yeah, thanks, Tolu. When you talk about fiscal policy, you are referring to policy that is geared towards achieving macroeconomic goals, goals of course, real GDP growth, low unemployment, a stable inflation rate via instruments such as taxes, public expenditure, and of course debt. I'm pretty sure you're referring to the document that was released, I think last month, the circular from the Ministry of Finance that talked about the fiscal policy measures of 2023, and then the tax amendments. Now that document is covering 3 areas essentially. There is the supplementary protection measures, which are in pursuit of the ECOWAS, common external tariffs. And then you also have the green taxes that have been introduced with respect to the single-use plastics and motor vehicles, depending on the capacity of the engine. And the controversial one, the revised rates, duty with respect to alcoholic beverages, tobacco, cigarettes. Let me say up front, I'll give you my take up front, that I think the additional taxes, the increases that appear in this 2023 fiscal policy measures, should be suspended. I'll provide justification, subsequently. But having said that, it's important to recognize that the overarching objective of the 2023 fiscal policy measures has to do with shoring up government revenue. And that is in line with the government strategic revenue growth initiative, where the government has said that one of its objectives will be to, or mechanisms, would be to continuously identify and enforce new as well as existing, taxes. So it's in line with that that initiative. And of course, that in this country today, one of our major challenges has to do with the low revenue to GDP. The Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative is aiming at moving up from 6% to about 15% before the end of 2023. So we have, as you often hear, we have a revenue challenge in this country, which is also why the government is also thinking of securitizing the CBN's ways and means. That will afford the government some breather, so some breathing space, such that you have that kind of money that is meant to be refunded within the same financial year, extended now for about 40 years. So the whole idea is to reduce pressure on the fiscal side, to enable government discharge most of its functions, free up resources. We spend so much. Look at the 2023 budget provision, for example, on debt service. We are budgeting over 6 trillion, about 6.3 trillion on debt service alone. But if we had the revenue, okay, some of these challenges, wouldn't be there, and government would be in a stronger position to discharge its functions. So the case of strong revenue for the country cannot be, overemphasized, and that's also why the IMF, has often advised that we should also do something about the, tax system. IMF has advised we should consider increasing the value-added tax, for example, from the current 7.5% and maybe move it up to 15%, over time. So what I'm saying is, it's all in line with shoring up revenue. But having said that, the national policy on tax that we have in Nigeria today, I think the latest is that of 2017. The national policy, makes it very clear. There is the principle of sustainability. Apart from the other principles there, you have that of simplicity, certainty. The tax system should be simple and certain. Taxpayers should be able to plan around it. There is also the issue of sustainability. And what that is emphasizing is that there should be a synergy. While we are trying to sustain, promote sustainable revenue for the government, that in doing so, there should be synergy between fiscal policy and the other objectives, macro objectives of the government. And that is why I started with the macro objectives of government. What are these macro objectives? Government is also interested in, growing GDP, real GDP growth, inclusive growth for that matter. Government is interested in reducing unemployment, in also reducing inflation. So these macro goals must be taken into cognizance when we are formulating, a tax, tax policy. So any tax policy that will lead to an increase in unemployment rate will be counterproductive, because even from what we know from secondary school, taxes can be used to redistribute income. Taxes can be used to even, bring about an increase in employment. So if you have a tax policy that will lead to increase in inflation, that will lead to reduction in increase in unemployment rate, then that kind of tax policy, will be counterproductive. And that is why I want to align my views or my position with that of the organized private sector, largely with that of the organized private sector. I've read the views of NECA. I've also read the position of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, including that of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises, and I want to align myself with those positions. Number one, let me even take up the man argument. Man is making an argument, which to me, stands to reason, that there is already a fiscal policy roadmap, blueprint, 2022 to 2024, this fiscal roadmap, which took effect on the 1st of June of 2022. So, based on that, manufacturers, the business community has made their plans, volume plans, sales forecasts, and all manner of forecasts have been made based on that, that approved document. To now introduce a new one would mean, getting them to, distort whatever they have done. And that will have implications for sales, that will have implications for capacity utilization, that will have implications for even unemployment. And the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, you may even end up not having the increase in revenue that you anticipated. Because when businesses don't make profit, when their sales drop, for example, you have high inventory and their sales drop, of course, taxes will reduce. So the point I'm making is this, that it's important that we will really synergize fiscal policy with other macroeconomic goals as stipulated in the national policy on top, tax policy that we have in Nigeria.
Now, Prof, many are worried that this, of course, there's already declined state of when you talk about sales by companies and we see what is happening with the figures that we look at. So it's a two-in-one question. They say if this is implemented, it could fuel illicit trade and also bring us back to recession. Also, layoffs would happen in some of these companies. What does that mean for our economy? That's on one side. For a struggling economy, let me put it that way, like Nigeria, that's on one side. Then on the ways and means, there have been lots of condemnations with regards to this. People saying that, no, that's not really the way to go. The government needs to get quick money to sort out some emergencies, as they would say. But what is your assessment? Because the debt continues to pile up.
Oh, yes, Tolu. Maybe I should start from the second one, the second concern about the ways and means. I think going forward, let me say, in quotes, the mistake has been made. By mistake, I mean the accumulation of the ways and means, even though one can also argue that the part of that too, was justified by the COVID of 2020 and also the recession we've had in 2016 and also in 2020. So that may have also necessitated the overdraft that the central bank made available to the government. But I would want to say that the arrangement that we'll have now is one that will give the government, particularly the next government, some breather. Again, it's interesting to note that the securities are not going to be issued to the public. So the issue of the private sector being crowded out may no longer arise, because that was the fear initially, that if you are securitizing and you make available the securities to the public, you end up crowding out the private sector. Pension funds, we have pension funds of around 14 trillion. If you put pension funds, other institutional investors invested in that kind of, instruments may really crowd out the private sector. But what we hear now is that the securities will be issued to the central bank. So it's the central bank that is taking up those securities. So it's just what you can call restructuring. So it's tantamount to restructuring their short-term debts to long-term debt, for about 40 years. So it's a breather because there's a moratorium, there's a grace period of 3 years, a moratorium on principal, which is very key. The interest rate for the first 3 years will simply be paid without the principal. Then after 3 years, both the principal and the interest will now be amortized over 37 years. So I think it's a sort of breather. Again, if you look at what we budgeted this year for debt service alone, 6.3 trillion. 6.3 trillion naira includes the cost of servicing the CBN's ways and means. And remember, when the government borrows from the CBN, it pays interest at the MPR plus 3%. Today, MPR is 18.5%. Plus 3% means the government will be paying interest at 20.5%. But with the arrangement, the interest rate is just going to be 9%, and it's going to be spread over a long period of time. So I think it's actually going to be, one sort of breather on the part of the government. But again, as I said earlier on, going forward, we should ensure that ways and means strictly comply with the provisions of the Central Bank Act, I think Section 32 or so, that says whatever we give as advance should not be more than 5% of the previous year's, actual revenue. The National Assembly should be ensure that is strictly adhered to. And if there are conditions that will warrant breaching that, again, the National Assembly, should be involved. So what has happened has happened. Let us, move forward, as a country. when I say what has happened, remember, the inflation rate we have had so far, such that has risen up to 22.04% as at March, was partly the result of these ways and means. So what has happened has happened. Moving forward, we should ensure that extant laws are, strictly complied with. Now, to the second, the first issue you raised. Of course, there's no doubt that if this is implemented as it is, the 2023 fiscal measures, if they are implemented, particularly with respect to the say local wines, all right. Remember, excise duties are duties on locally produced goods. When you raise them, okay, what happens? You make the cost of the production of those commodities, more expensive. So you encourage imports, all right, and in the process too, that is also likely to encourage smuggling. So tomorrow you now find smuggled wine, into the country all over the place, and of course on smuggling you end up losing even the revenue. So if you have an increase in domestically produced goods, that will lead to shutdown of those firms, that will lead to loss of jobs, for example. Of course, whatever policy you are trying to put in place negates the very omnibus objective for which you have put it in place in the first instance. So I think, as I said earlier on, that yes, the government needs revenue, but there has to be a proper balance between that objective and the other the objectives. Look at the issue of the import adjustment duty with respect to motor vehicles. Okay, this is an era where we are talking about removal of fuel subsidy. Yes, it's been suspended, but it's something that will eventually happen. So if we are going to remove fuel subsidy, we know the effect it's going to have on transport. And then when you also, on the other hand, impose this duty and this levy on motor vehicles that are coming in, okay, you can now imagine the compounded effect it's going to have on transport. And transport is a major sector that drives the Nigerian economy. The manufacturing sector, as we speak, is still in the negative territory in terms of growth rates. Manufacturing contributes about 8-9% to GDP, okay, and it's still in the negative territory. It's only the services sector that has been posting a positive, growth rate. So this kind of policy has the potential in the downside risk, if you like, of further dragging the manufacturing sector into the negative territory. That's why I also said, initially that is better. We'll pause it. We allow the one that is currently in place, around which manufacturers have also made their plans, to continue to run. Okay? As I said earlier on, we need to ramp up revenue in this country, no doubt about that. Or how do we go about it? The advice of the IMF is very, key here. And what is that advice? We should widen the tax net. Widening the tax net is one way to go about it. Although you and I were in Calabar, yes, we just returned from Calabar, where central bank, made it clear that BVN number, has risen by about 57 million. Yeah. So if the number of BVN, those that have registered for BVN, have risen to 57 million, for example, and then you match that against the number of the tax payer base in the countries. We hear 40 million, we hear a number that is below at least the number that has done BVN. So that tells you that there is a gap, and that tells you that you still have a number of people that have not been captured. Okay, so we need to widen the net. You have a country to.
Yeah, let me allow you just land.
Yes, I was talking about how to. Yes, number one, widen the tax net. Number two, the issue of tax, the tax collection rate efficiency also has to be improved upon.
That's adopting
Tax
technology
collection
and all of
efficiency
that.
is very low in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Oh yes, the tax. I want to commend the FIRS. The tax promise is one way around it. But tax collection efficiency, compliance ratio. We should also do something about compliance ratio. Taxpayer education is very key. Okay, and then this issue of social contracts, accountability for tax revenue. Okay, is also important. And then cost of governance. Reducing cost of governance is also important. How do we reduce cost of governance?
For today.
We have a lot of loopholes going on.
Yeah, to be blocked. I have the
issue of waiver.
Practitioners and even the leadership in the House. Prof, I must thank you so much for your time, Professor Uche Owaleke. I know we can go on and on. This topic, really very interesting. I think we need to have a part 2 of this discussion because there's a lot in this, talking about the fiscal measures instituted by the federal government. But today, this is much time can take. Professor Uche Owaleke, Professor Finance, Capital Markets, thank you so much for your time on the show and your contribution. Do enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.
Thank you, Tolu.